Hi, everybody. We are live on Replenish Earth. I am Tia Kansara, your host. Today on the show, we're going to have Tony Lai, where we're going to be exploring global, human, digital commons and rulemaking and enforcement on environmental preservation. I think it's an incredible topic, very, very timely. And we'd love to delve into what is the rigor required to account for and measure and deliver on mass climate legislation. Today, we've got Tony Lai, who unleashes the collective potential at a human and systems level. Of course, he's a lawyer, researcher, technology entrepreneur, advising a variety of different companies, from startups to governments, law firms, non-profits, building the future of trust, transactions, and dispute resolution. Without further ado, Tony, welcome to Replenish Earth.
Tia, it's so lovely to be here. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Where are you at the moment?
I'm currently in Berlin right now, and I've been spending a bit of time back in Europe, which has been really, really nice. Spent most of lockdown with my family in the UK, but we've gathered now. There's been a bit of a gathering of the tribe in Berlin, the tribe being my adopted family, the Embassy Network, which is a community of folks experimenting with the commons, including common spaces for living as well. So I feel very lucky to be in the community right now.
Yeah, and I suppose now is the time that one would be exploring a variety of different experiments in living, in being, in communing. And Embassy Network is a network that you've been part of for a while, isn't it?
Yeah, I'd say the last 10 years or so, basically since I left my job at a law firm in London, went to California to Stanford, and then not long after that sort of found my way into some of these communities of wonderful people in San Francisco and the Bay Area who have been, I think, thinking about alternative ways of doing all sorts of things for quite some time. So yeah, it's been a beautiful 10 years in California, and then more recently I've been setting my sights on Asia and back to Europe as well.
I hear you. So one of the things that we've been exploring at Replenish Earth is really the governing principles of the global commons. And we've, sort of called it the Protocol.Earth project. And it's really about how can we sort of mesh a lot of the, emerging tech, this sort of exponential tech, towards the direction of protecting the planet. Like, there are incredible tools out there that we can use. So, and I know that this is a massive field that you've been working in, both in terms of sort of like how to improve interoperability between legacy systems and current systems, but also in terms of the space between, the digital world and the physical world, how that sort of like interrelates. And there's so much that I'm sure we can sort of delve into today. But would love to sort of start with how might we create these sort of better interoperable sort of systems that allow us to be at the table to make those decisions that we so desperately need to be taking?
Wow, that's a big question, and you set the context beautifully. How do we do it? Right, I think
solve the world.
First off, I want to focus on the word create for a moment. I think creativity as a human force is something that we are beginning, I think, to lean into a little more. And I come from a very, very sort of ordered sort of profession in terms of the law, and things are structured, and you have precedent, and there are ways of doing things, and they establish these sometimes simple systems, sometimes very complex systems. And in the sort of I think the worst cases, those complex systems become very, very removed from our daily experience and our underlying moralities, our underlying human goals. And you see that with a whole range of issues in terms of accessing the system, accessing the legal system, accessing our socioeconomic systems. There's an imbalance in terms of the way the system has ultimately been constructed into some very, very complex structures that, again, coming back to this notion of alienation, I think we end up being alienated from each other, from nature, from our work, from ourselves. And I think coming back to the notion of creativity and creative potential and the process and act and collective process of creating together, I think there's something really, really important there to think about when we ask, how do we start this? Where do we begin? And that's really what I love about our conversations, Tia, to the extent that you've been able to embed and engage yourself within this, one of the most human of professions, architecture. If it's about our human relationship with the environment, our human relationship with each other, and how the constructed environment essentially allows us to reflect these human qualities. I think that is one of the things that makes architecture one of these most humanistic, even whilst at the same time having this very sort of core engineering, science-based sort of foundation. And my hope is that we can start thinking about law and legal systems and how we develop legal systems, again, as you're saying, in concert with some of the digital technologies or some of the digital affordances that are being made available by, it's a step-by-step process, and there's a lot of different things coming through the pipeline, whether it's, starting off, it was just difficult getting law firms to engage with the internet, full stop. But then we're now looking at artificial intelligence, we're looking at blockchain, we're looking at these ledger systems that might work towards managing some of the reams and reams of data that are currently out there, governing all aspects of our lives. And I think, once again, coming back to that core word, create, I think recognizing that creation is a fundamentally human activity, and how we go about creating is really important to bear in mind in terms of the impact upon the end product. Now, when we're starting to think about these global interoperability systems for managing commons, or local systems that might be, much more tailored towards the needs of a local population, how can we make sure that our moral, ethical goals and collective hopes are really embedded as part of that creation process? Sorry, that was a bit of a monologue, but I think it's a big question, and I love that we.
This is totally. I mean, yeah, like this is don't worry about monologuing. Like, it's a spotlight on you, babes. So one of the things that I love so much about the essence, right? Like the essence of architecture is that it's an art form. Everything that has been created through an imagination of practicality, solutions to cater to the inner, the outer, the sort of like the external forces in the climate that we're in. Each architectural form is climate specific, sometimes, not all the time. And within that sort of art form is, of course, the structural underpinning that has been created by way of, making something replicable, something standardized, something in a framework that can be tested over time. So some of the most beautiful architectural gems that we experience in life are today still standing, because they have, imagine designing Aleppo 1,000 years ago and knowing that nuclear bombs were going to come from, I don't know, China. Like where could we have designed structures and systems to cater to a future that is unknown? And I feel very largely that a lot of the structures and the systems that we're at right now with the pandemic, for example, or whether it is the evolution of our relationship with the planet, I think there is a huge amount that we're learning that is sort of like bubbling up to the surface, which we weren't really aware of. It's like, is social media good for us? And then you've got the Social Dilemma Netflix series, like the documentary, which is really fascinating on like, what does it mean to have your data available for to commoditize your data, right? And it's fascinating that we do have say in a lot of the things that we do. But there are many things that we don't have say in. So for those things that we don't have say in, how might we galvanize more people to take action, to, become aware of what's happening? Yeah, would love to know some of your thoughts on that, Tony.
So there's a few things I picked up there. There's one is this notion of emergence and the unknown, and the notion that we're entering into a stage of our sort of globalized society, but also on a sort of a local basis, a time of deep uncertainty and in many senses an emergency, whether we're talking about the ecosystem destruction emergency or this data governance emergency that's brought up by the social dilemma and the work of Tristan Harris and his colleagues. It's, I think, interesting that you then sort of turn that to this notion of action, because I think what you're getting at here is the notion that uncertainty and a lack of ability to foresee what your actions may end up doing, that uncertainty essentially paralyzes us. So that's the sort of like the contours of the question as I understood it, Tia. And so I think in response to that, I think I want to pick up on this word that you mentioned as well, which is imagination. And I think that imagination is something that fundamentally, as you were saying, architecture is all about imagination. It's these imagined constructs that become materialized, and we're able to look beyond the lack of clarity about like this empty space, and we're able to create a form that allows people to access and be welcomed and interface and engage. And in various different ways, you can design for opinionated architecture in terms of agency or belonging or cooperation or collaboration. There's a whole bunch of opinionated systemic structures that can be embedded within what was previously a blank page and deeply unknown. And that requires an active imagination, not just on the part of the architect, but on the part of the entire team and the people who are going into the building years and years later. The imagination is engaged at every single level. And I think that what I've been talking about with policy makers, lawyers, friends who are working in complex systems, and there's a notion of how we bring imagination into constructing these rule-making systems that we're thinking about. How do we foresee the interactions of these possible things that are coming through the pipeline when those things coming through the pipeline themselves are so hard to understand in many cases? And so this is in a way it's a form of moral imagination, a term that Phoebe Tickell has used recently to talk about how we step outside of our sort of current paralysis, in a sense, this notion of the unknown, this sort of fear-based sort of fight or flight inspired inability to sort of really look into that sort of creative potential that we have as ourselves and that we have as a collective. What are the ways in which we can actually create the spaces where we can sort of lower our collective noradrenaline levels, really engage our emotional, intuitive sides, and step together into an imaginative space, whether that's as funders or as policymakers, as lawyers who are drafting these architectural systems for our society. I think that previous act of humanity, in a sense, coming back to that notion of how we create and I think relating it to how we galvanize is engaging with our imagination collectively in safe spaces where we can get over this sense of everything's going to pot, everything is going bad, and recognizing that there's a whole bunch of traumas, there's a whole bunch of collective grief that is happening right now, and when people individually or collectively are in those situations, you need to have some really intentional holding of space, I think, to be able to then start thinking about action. So that's like a sort of a foundational forceps to get us, self-somatically, I think, collectively, somatically into a much more sort of open-minded space where we can then start really engaging our imaginations to then, again, I think, step outside of ourselves and start thinking about the commons, start thinking about the others, start thinking about nature, putting our senses into what it means to really, really nurture and tend and care for a river or a forest or a mountain, which is something that I'm so fascinated by in New Zealand, for example, where they have enabled, and again, this isn't an individual thing, this is an explicitly collective action to engage and participate with imagination, with a certain kind of moral imagination around what it means to be in relationship with, to really nurture a natural wonder that is deeply connected to the people who interrelate with that. If you can only listen, and if you can only create the spaces where we can listen together, and as deeply social animals, if we can set in place these frameworks for participation in governance, in creating rules, in creating these systems, that participation in collective imagination that unlocks, I think, the access and the belonging and the collective purpose potential. That my belief is that is deeply embedded in what law is actually about. And it's kind of lost its way a little in the complexity, but if we can bring it back to that, and that law is about building collective trust together, that collective trust, I think, can then be the real foundation for collective action.
I think that was like a mic drop situation. So from an economic standpoint, economics is the study of the scarcity of resources. Innate in economics is fear and scarcity and insecurity, for which many of the systems that we see today have evolved beyond that to the stage where it really does feel as if, we are creating even more mass hysteria, even more insecurity, even more open a bottle, then you will get happiness. You're not happy otherwise, right? So insecurity is innate in the system. Now, how do we develop that trust? Because I admit that came from sort of more of my economics perspective, but from a legal stance, law has not become, and this is my own personal experience in family law and criminal law, is that what does become a legal setting is often whoever's debate, whoever's argument is the strongest, whoever is the most convincing, often manipulative, and to the detriment of the people that are involved, of course. But with the view that there is this legislation that is being created and the trust mechanisms, and I'm going to get to the sort of digital side of this soon, but surely, like, to make it interoperable, we almost need to identify what needs to be updated, and then those sort of like updates need somehow to be in alignment both with like the past and the future, because we've got legacy systems to sort of create connection, bridge to, and then we've also got the unknowable, right? Like, trust in the unknowable is the ultimate trust in not knowing, trust in not having reason to know, or not knowing what's going to happen, and yet having that trust, not using inferiority as a basis for distrusting. So for example, with without getting too much into politics, like creating these sorts of weapons of mass destruction, they weren't found, but it was like the biggest joke ever that we were going to go as the UK, although I remember marching with SOAS in 2003, make tea not war. We galvanized thousands of people around the UK to do that, and yet it feels as if we weren't really heard. And the sort of legal systems sort of like backed up the political systems, and therefore we really, as a human community living around the world, felt very unheard and unseen. And I think that these sorts of systems, especially when it comes towards advanced artificial intelligence, and this is sort of delving into the work of a professor in Hong Kong called De Kai, talking about linguistics in AI and how natural language and how the programming of the sentiment, right? The sentiment programming is so important, that the technology reflects what is most important for all of humanity, not the bias with which it's being designed with. So obviously there are incredible biases that have been introduced into the system. I'm quite curious about your thoughts on that.
Okay, so you've given me a large playing field right now, just in terms of this. I heard you touch on scarcity of resources as the sort of like the baseline for economic theory as we know it right now. I would, not having studied economics myself, I don't want to go too much into that definition, but one of my heroes and the basis of a lot of my research and the work that I hope to be able to do around the commons is an economist called Elinor Ostrom. She won the Nobel Economics Prize in 2009, and I'd say that less the study of scarcity of resource and more the study of interaction around resources is where she sort of like focuses in particular around what it means to, I think, move beyond the notion of scarcity as part of self-organizing governance mechanisms. And she looks at a series of design principles around how common pool resources or resources that might otherwise be scarce but can actually be organized in a way with the sort of rules and different accountability mechanisms put in place to sort of govern the way that we can interact around those resources so that they're not scarce. And so in some sense, yes, I think there's a really interesting bridge to, is there something around interoperability in the way that we interoperate and interact that can overcome notions and narratives of scarcity? And then you brought this into this notion of institutions and the loss of trust in institutions. You mentioned weapons of mass destruction. And I think this relates also obviously to data in the sense that institutions that were making various arguments, and you mentioned manipulation, you mentioned the lack of accountability or listening that happened with a lot of these legacy systems, we can call them. These institutions, I think, have been set up in such a way, they've been programmed in such a way to gather power and focus and concentrate that power in certain individuals who are operating those mechanisms of governance and government. And I think it's really worthwhile imagining what it would be like were things structured slightly differently in terms of the power distribution for institutions like that, so that things like the notion of a trust in an institution, even though you're not knowing that they're everything that they're doing, but sort of knowing that they have your interests at heart, and therefore you're sort of delegating to them some of that complexity around the sort of the back end legal and technical architecture of how the system as a whole works. You can sort of delegate that to them, and that's the sort of the trust in not knowing, I think, that comes through this sort of translational interface layer between the sort of the back end complexity and the front end agency. In an ideal scenario, the ability for a user to be able to understand a human being, an actor within an ecosystem, to understand that their actions and their choices are being listened to and are having some impact on ultimately what is being presented to them. And it's not doing so from a manipulative position, but it's doing so from a I'm on your side position. And so that's all in a sense a sort of very, very theoretical, non-specific way of just talking about some of the things that Durkheim has been working on for a long time, some of the things that Tristan references in The Social Dilemma, which is the notion that these systems are being used against us, whether it's governmental systems or corporate sort of surveillance capital inspired system, but there are a bunch of areas where this underlying set of data that is happening through our use of our phones or our use of our web, computers, travel everywhere. All of that is actually, in some sense, being used to manipulate us, as you were saying. And so, part of I think the hope in actually looking beyond that, and again, this is then sort of really looking to engage our imagination in, how might systems be different, is to, I think, look at some of these underlying principles. And say, well, government is set up and is supposed to be looking out for us, but there's certain situations where that there's been a disconnect, and we're seeing that sort of trust in traditional centers, legacy centers of authority and governance, becoming a little bit more brittle. And, talking to some of my policymaker friends, they're all genuinely interested in what it means then for a more empowered and engaged civil sector society, and how does that interoperate with the legacy systems. And specifically within that category of civil sector societies, I want to highlight some of the emerging systems around data governance that are very, very much more tailored towards our individual and community interests. And this is the notion of data trusts or data co-ops. This idea that you can have a benevolent intermediary, maybe a nonprofit, maybe an organization that manifestly looking out for your interests, having the capability to, in a similar way, serve useful materials to you, help to sort of manage the complexity of privacy, consent options, and managing the where your data is being used to sort of help discover and bring to you the connections and services and products that you most need, but knowing that they are fully aligned with your underlying beliefs and your interests. So, for example, if you are someone who truly fundamentally believes that ecosystem destruction and climate action is the most important thing, and you want to make sure that all of your activities, whether conscious or unconscious, are ultimately feeding into a commons, a data commons potentially, that is being used for the purposes only of institutions and companies that align with your larger beliefs. We could have, and I think this speaks then to some of the notions around certification and validation that you've been looking into and researching, Tia, but you have then the potential for a much more aligned set of incentives, really, for the various different organizations out there and how they can operate. And I think this notion of incentives then is really interesting when we bring it back to blockchain, and we bring it back to economics, and we bring it back to the way that law and economics and technology all fit together in this new world of ubiquitous data. And it starts creating alternatives, right? You start putting in place different kinds of incentive mechanisms, and you're starting to see that already here in Europe when you have the national broadcaster in the Netherlands basically just gave up trying to do micro-targeting advertising at all. They recognized that there were a bunch of people who were sort of sorting out their cookies, and they were like, well, we're just going to take a stand and we're just going to not do any micro-targeted advertising at all. They developed an in-house system that was kind of based upon what we used to do in terms of contextual adverts. Like if you're, looking at an article about, forestry, maybe you'll be interested in, this project that's, helping to plant more trees in your local area, right? That sort of contextual advertising doesn't actually need to know all these things about you, but it's sort of more about what's relevant to you in that particular moment. And they actually increased their ad revenues by something like 70, 80%. From before, they were doing all of the tracking, and part of that is obviously because they were able to recoup the, I think 30, 40, even higher percent of the money that they were paying that goes directly to Google, Facebook, Amazon, these ad broker
and all the ad brokers.
And so, I mean, it's been shown that with the right rules and with the right frameworks and the right technical support, that you can create changes in the incentive frameworks, and those advertisers are loving it. Apparently, this is all through a report. I can't remember where I read it, but it's very, very appealing to commercial advertisers to be able to still, get the conversions that they're looking for. But anyway, I'm going on a little bit, but sort of connecting, I think, these various different pieces around, trust, sentiment programming, manipulation, legacy systems, accountability, power. I mean, there's a lot there. And I love the sort of the weaving that you're connecting around it. And I think specifically bringing it back to what it means for how we construct these systems that are more about interaction around resources and less around scarcity of resources. How we, set in place a series of new norms. It's not all about the laws. It's about the ways that you see people following, the way that the accountability is, in a sense, embedded within what is being shared, and that everybody is having to share on the same basis. In a sense, this is kind of how financial disclosure systems work. Right? There's, everybody is subject to the same transparency and accountability requirements, and therefore you have a certain level of trust that's built into that exchange mechanism that, you know, puts in and enforces certain rules to sort of support that trust and interaction. And so one of the, I think, most exciting things that, you know, I've been looking forward to you know, digging in with you is this notion of climate legislation. What does it mean to have governments looking at creating certain disclosure requirements and accountability requirements around their environmental, social, and governance sort of obligations that start to create this kind of transparent playing field and a certain set of accountability requirements beyond what's already there that can start to, I think, generate these new and different incentives for hopefully working on some of these global commons related projects.
And one of the biggest issues that I think that we're finding is that there is a lot of talk, just not a lot of enforcement. And it's very difficult to enforce when it's the government themselves that are being held accountable. Of course, you can sort of like go a little bit higher. So, you know, this year we're going to be celebrating 75 years of the United Nations. And, you know, what is quite curious, I think, for us is, you know, from the League of Nations to the United Nations to what next? It's sort of like, you know, is it the moment that these sort of like overarching organizations, platforms, governance structures and systems are further decentralized so that it's less about, you know, the G8 and the G20, and it's more about who are the people and what are they doing? Because ultimately, as we used to say in the army, we walk at the slowest person's pace. You know, in our troop, in our section, you know, in your battalion, you are walking at the person, like the speed at the person who is the slowest, because we're protecting, right? We're protecting. Instead of sort of having this incredible gap between the first person and the master soldier, all the way back to, you know, the person who's sort of finding it difficult because, you know, maybe they've been shot in the leg or whatever. It's about not leaving anyone behind. And yet less about the hierarchical structures and systems of the military and or the purpose of the military, more about the sort of the socio, you know, psychological factors of bringing people on board and taking them with you so that we can sort of enforce these, you know, parameters and legislations, because it's less, not just about, you know, having the sort of rule of law on you that, you know, you will be taxed. There's an eco tax. If you're an organization that is, you know, pillaging our environment and depleting our resources, that you know, we're going to come down on you like a ton of bricks. But it's also that sort of the people, you know, incentive, the power, the creativity, the imagination and inspiration, which is about giving people the opportunity to come out of their shells and say, right, yes, so sorry, how can I be involved? Like how less about like, tell me what to do and I'll do it, and more about, yeah, that's really interesting, coming to the table, participating, like the constitution in Iceland that was rewritten by the people. But yeah.
So what I'm taking from that is that there's this recognition that the current state of sort of global agreement making and the enforcement of that, for example, the Paris Accords or otherwise, there's a deep gap between the aspirations and the actual reality of enforcement and whether that actually ends up sort of changing anything. And I think you see this throughout the legal system, the time gap between somebody making a claim against a bad actor, whether that's an individual, a corporation, or a government, and the process of defense of that and the path through that. It can be several years before it ends up showing that there was actually a legal activity. And then once you've been through that process, then the question of, you know, what penalty, what enforcement, if any, is in place. And I was watching Edwin, just sort of like a parallel example. I was watching Edward Snowden on a podcast recently. He was talking about the recent decision from the Ninth Circuit of Appeals in the US that basically deemed the program that he uncovered completely illegal and essentially not able to show any sort of real impact in stopping any cases of terrorism at all. This sort of massive dragnet sort of data gathering that the NSA was doing. And that's sort of 7 years after sort of he first exposed it in 2013. And even with that judgment, like there's really no impact upon the government at all. The program itself has been closed down, or it's sort of been jiggered to sort of like, fine. And so I think specifically to your point around enforcement of governments, let alone enforcement on corporations or other actors within it, how do we go about it? Where is the fundamental legitimacy of a mechanism that doesn't, really have any teeth to it? And so I think that, yeah, it's one of the big challenges right now that we have, given the sort of international law system we have. And I think, referencing the UN kind of essentially serves at the pleasure of the nation states in various different actions, and needs to be invited in, and has a very, very sort of limited enforcement capacity as more of a sort of like a convener, a dialogue creator. And obviously legitimacy does flow from that dialogue and that participation. But I think that the real sort of like lawmaking power still exists at that sort of nation state level when it comes to enforcing and deciding to enforce upon some of these regulations. So that brings us to decentralization, right? And so you bring that in as like this, there's this thing that people have been talking about, are there ways of actually changing the ways that people can be monitored and held to account through a more decentralized system that isn't as hierarchical and top down, and this person does this thing bad and they get reported up the chain, and then somebody comes down with a bag of bricks, as you were saying. I think the core thing to remember about or to value in decentralization is that it does bring about this participation. It does bring about this ability to, on a broader sort of thematic level, it's more about engaging people on a grassroots level and like seeing what emerges. And I think to that extent, it there's a fundamental, I think, basis in legitimacy that comes from participation. And yet at the same time, I also want to bring up the things like social credit systems. Right, so this is, in a sense, it's a decentralized way for a institution or a set of communities to manage, the monitoring and the sort of reputation of different actors within an ecosystem, that their credit. And I think the most well-known version of this is obviously the one that's being developed in various different ways in China, and there's been a lot of scare stories about that. And I think rightly so, when you have what in many terms seems like a rule of law focused nation that has very, very comprehensive laws and constitutions and various different things, but then still operates within the framework of these laws apply in certain situations, and who gets to apply those laws is sort of very, very centrally determined. In that kind of a situation, when you have a system that provides this level of reporting on a decentralized basis, but still ends up with certain individuals or entities or institutions having, in a sense, absolute power, that I think has put a kind of association with the notion of social credit systems into everybody's minds, and I think that's totally fair. I do want to say though, if it were structured and designed differently, might there be some way of looking into some of these underlying frameworks of reputation, trust, accountability, data sharing on a more fully decentralized basis, where the organizations that are managing the different data that is being shared for the benefit of you as an individual, making the choices that you want to make. I think ultimately that's where this larger sort of movement around decentralization comes, is that we're seeking to make people's individual choices more powerful, more relevant. And if we can bring that about, then we have the opportunity to realign as individuals and as groups of individuals that have built this sort of baseline trust. And that can be through a particular organization or through a particular collective or particular nation state. But, there are more and more different kinds of, I think, sort of trust units that we can, I think, rely upon as part of a different kind of social credit system or environmental credit system, or we can think about it in all manner of ways. But this is ultimately about how we share that data, how whether or not it's interoperable. What are the rules around that sharing, and do we have the power to use that to make different choices ourselves, so that the sum total of those choices starts to actually have an effect upon the underlying system. Right? You can still interface with that legacy system, but through your own choices and collective choices, you're actually starting to move that legacy system towards a better design, hopefully, that is actually much more in tune and resonance with nature.
And it's really, really important and really timely to be able to do something like that, for ourselves, we can actually make those steps and we can become more aware. We can use these sorts of tools that can really aid that sort of like the decentralization, the taking responsibility ourselves to recognize where it is that these legislations are in alignment with who we are, what we're doing, and when it's not. I mean, when it comes to our local environment, I've been really impressed with Westminster City Council. They put bicycle lanes out, and it's these steps that really are listening to your borough or your people, and understanding who they are and how they're on their own journey, and sort of meeting them where they are, so that even the legislation, even the actions and the budgets are sort of in alignment with that. I feel that there is so many fun things that we can do in this area, not least just becoming more aware and sort of learning about that. We're sort of in the final leg of our hour with you, Tony, and I'm sort of keen that people find out more about maybe some of the projects. No, why? What do you mean? I mean, you're absolutely welcome to to bust out some Pavarotti, but yeah, it's trust me, he would. But one of the things that I was really sensing and feeling is it's a lot of the questions that you're asking right now are questions that people are especially just by virtue of you having been in this space for a while, the questions that you're asking are going to have consequences for a lot of us. The questions that you're asking in terms of the legislation, the data, the use of security, the kind of infrastructure that you're creating and that you're both questioning and involving the dialogue on, has consequences for a lot of us. We'd love to know specifically maybe some of the projects that we can follow you on. Some of the, I know that I've shared the link tree to your work, so people can get in contact with you on LinkedIn, etc. But yeah, tell us a little bit more.
Well, I really appreciate that, and I think this invitation to awareness, I think, speaks to the this aspect of participation, but also from, I think, multiple different angles and different perspectives. And so that's something that we've been trying at Stanford, the center I work at, Codex. We've been trying to really bring together different disciplines and different perspectives as part of looking at where computational law and legal engineering, which is this field that looks at this sort of intersection of rules and digital systems. I mean, we've been really trying to make a lot of the cutting edge work in this area available to a wider audience. And so we've put together something called the Stanford Journal of Blockchain Law and Policy, which you can find through the link on the link tree. And as part of that, one of the interdisciplinary sort of series that we're hosting is called Earth 2030. Again, looking at this notion of imagination, but from the perspective of policymakers and lawyers and technologists who are working on some of these digital infrastructure pieces of what we hope can be a system that does bring about some of this accountability, does create some of this transparency, and does so with a view towards the needs of those organizations as well. And so one of the fundamental needs is around privacy. If we are going to have corporations sharing data about their impact upon ecosystems, to be able to do so without uncovering sort of trade secrets or various contracts which are confidential, I think that's again, where some of this infrastructure and an understanding of how the infrastructure can allow for the validation of certain claims without needing to see that underlying data, which comes about through something called zero knowledge proof systems. I think there's a lot of really interesting technical research going into that and helping economists, sociologists, lawyers, policymakers see some of the potential of these new technological affordances is very much what we're trying to do, tied together with a notion of imagination about the future. And so Earth 2030 is a series where we really look to world building as an inspiration. And that's going to be, we're going to be having another edition of that focused upon legal protection of the biosphere later this year. And that'll be followed up by a sort of a more focused blockchain law and policy conference in January. So all of that can be seen through, and for folks who are sort of less legal policy oriented, one of the links in that link tree is a short story that I wrote with a colleague of mine called Primavera de Filippi, which was submitted for a prize that Nesta, the UK funder, put out around decentralization. And so that's just a short story which I think fits in with what we're hoping to generate and allow the emergence of a lot more of, which is this kind of foresight-based sort of futures planning that can sort of really relate some of these things that are coming through the pipeline more in human terms and in terms of the kinds of worlds that we do want to live in, and trying to get through some of that uncertainty and fog of pandemic that we're currently in.
Beautiful. Just looking through your link tree at the moment and just having a look at the actual website for Earth 2030, like very, very interesting about, the story angle. It's almost as if, these narratives and these stories are just so important to be able to share and to go into the more sort of the lighter touch, the more creative, the artistic touch of what we want to sort of, to explore. So it's less about, how can we look at the laws and, control systems and, whatever, but it's
so much of what I have learned over the last decade is the importance of stories and the importance of relating on a human level. And that's, whether that's through helping to set up StartX, the Stanford Startup Accelerator, and sort of really engaging with these sort of stories of change and transformation that the entrepreneurs we were supporting were seeking to promote. And now working with something called the Impact Collective, based out of South Korea, but it's sort of an Asia-wide collective of social impact-focused entrepreneurs, really focusing on their stories and how the community as a whole can be involved in their stories and help to emerge how those stories connect to these larger narratives of ecosystemic protection and food systems, or the whole works. I think that again is like a layer of interoperability that I hope, it's far beyond my sort of pay grade, but I know a lot of wonderful conveners, facilitators, storytelling geniuses who are working now with the Impact Collective, with others like that, to I think create story interoperability as well. So hopefully we'll have the sort of the technical, the legal, and the sort of the story narrative interoperability that will give us this pathway forwards.
I think in terms of last moments really, but do you feel that there is a call to action aside from, of course, like finding out more about your work, Earth 2030, reading the story? How can people who are listening in also find ways to use their art to explore this field, like the process that you've used to be able to do that?
On the broadest basis, if we were to go back to this notion of creation and creativity, and no matter I think what background or area you come from, if you're able to gather with a group of your friends and intentionally create space for moral imagination, imagining sort of situations that are relevant to you, and what are some of those sort of real moral issues that are sort of raised by these concerns, and just create space to talk through that with your friends. I think engaging that muscle is really my call to action, and not to resign that sort of decision making to these institutions that have, and legacy systems that have for a long time, I think, taken decisions on our behalf. But really, re-engaging that, and then maybe choosing a bit more intentionally who you then do trust to make some of these decisions on your behalf. That's the sort of, I guess, the broadest call to action that I can make. And then, yeah, please follow along with our work, and we'd love to connect with anybody who's interested in exploring collaborations with us.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Tony, for your time and your dedication to the subject. I think we're going to see some really fascinating examples of the use of sort of, the new kinds of technology that are coming to the fore, together with the bigger questions that we've never really had the opportunity to ask, because we're in this sort of like, this is normal. And now that that has a crack in it, a really good crack, it feels as if the crack in the system is going to allow us to sort of peer in and, look inside and think, well, yeah, this doesn't kind of work. So it gives us an opportunity to sort of, instead of just, kind of a kintsugi, put a bit of gold on it and make it into a piece of art. The cracks are almost, visible to the extent where if we can create art with them.
Wabi sabi.
Totally.
Yeah, we don't want anything too perfect. I think that's the danger of trying to. That's the danger of trying to create too much order and relying too much upon the notion that there is some perfect design, some perfect utopia that everybody is going. It is messy. It is going to be gray sometimes, but it's in those asymmetries and in those imperfections that we're going to find beauty in each other. So, wabi sabi.
On that note, Tony, an absolute pleasure to have you on the Replenish Earth Live, and also everybody else for watching. Thank you very much for your time. And if you have any questions, please do share them on our Facebook and YouTube page. And also, please don't forget to subscribe to our Replenish Earth YouTube channel. I'm sure we're going to have some very, very interesting interviews in the future. Also, I mean, Tony, you're kind of a difficult one to beat, but an absolute pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you very much, everybody, and see you soon.